So hello and welcome everybody to this new episode of Quad Videocasts. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Rainer Quitzel. Rainer is a research group leader and speaker of the research area of energy systems and societal change at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. His work focuses on the politics and governance of the global energy transition, with a particular focus on innovation and industrial policy. He's also a senior lecturer at the Technical University of Berlin in sustainability and innovation. Rainer, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So Rainer, before we start talking about the article we have written together, I would like to take a step back so we could talk a little bit about what happened in 2020. So overall, a very unusual year. Many problems that came to the surface that we did not anticipate because of the pandemic. I would like to hear your take on it. Overall, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on world politics, and what has changed in a year?
What we see in terms of impacts from the pandemic in general is that we don't necessarily see drastic changes, but I think we see that things have become more pronounced. So certain trends that we already saw before have become more pronounced, have accelerated in some ways. We see that in the energy transition, and we see that more generally also in global politics. And I think the one thing I would highlight here is really the role of the state. I mean, we see that with the pandemic, the role of the state within the economy has really increased significantly due to all the stimulus spending and intervention that has occurred as a result of the pandemic. But this is, of course, a trend we have already seen, at least since the financial crisis, where we also saw an increased role of the state as a result. And now we sort of see a second boost here. But we also see that this is not homogeneous, not the same across the globe. We see, especially sort of the Western economies, China, the big players really stepping in, also to differing degrees, but still stepping in and increasing the role of the state in the economy, where that maybe wasn't as pronounced before the pandemic. But in developing countries, in poorer countries, that's simply not possible. So here we see that, the capacities to really do this, also differ across countries.
So, on to the article now. The COVID-19 crisis deepens the gulf between leaders and laggards in the global energy transition. You can find the article on the April edition of Energy Research and Social Science. You can find the link if you check our description. And Rainer, one of the concepts we use a lot in the article is decarbonization. So that is something we mention a lot. That is something we have discussed a lot in other situations here in the channel, but elsewhere. In your opinion, what are the key elements for the decarbonization of the energy sector?
What we need, obviously, is a transition to a carbon neutral energy sector, meaning an energy sector that no longer emits CO2. And to achieve this, we need to transform the energy sector. That means completely eliminating energy production from fossil fuels. That means replacing this with zero carbon energy sources, renewable energy. In some parts of the world, countries are still trying to do this also with nuclear energy. But it's not only that, of course, it's also a matter of then transforming the end use sectors, because for instance, road transport is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on oil as a energy carrier. Now, to reduce the consumption of oil in the transport sector means actually converting these vehicles to electric vehicles, and thereby shifting the energy production essentially to the electricity sector. So electrifying the transport sector, or it means going into synthetic fuels. And again, that means ultimately shifting the production of energy to the electricity sector, because the way to then produce those synthetic fuels is also through electrolyzers that are powered then by renewable energy or by zero carbon energy.
Rainer, where and in what sector has this progress occurred more significantly?
The energy transition has essentially started mainly in the electricity sector. So that means that we've started deploying renewable energy in the electricity sector in some countries, in sort of leading countries. There's been significant progress in that field. Germany is one of those leaders. We've reached around 40% of renewable electricity generation compared to almost zero 25 years ago. So there's significant progress, but of course, I mean, there's still a long way to go also in the electricity sector. In the end use sectors, we've seen a lot less progress. I mean, electrification of transport, decarbonization of industry, there we have seen much less progress. So, you know, in relative terms, progress has been much more significant in the electricity sector. And of course, that also makes sense because as I explained it just now, you know, some of the steps that we need to take actually require first a zero carbon electricity sector to then power, for example, electric vehicles with clean electricity.
We can now move on to the differences among countries, right? We have talked a little bit about that already, but what countries have invested more in renewable energy, renewable power generation capacity? And why do some countries, in your view, take a more serious stance towards this?
I think there's sort of two fundamental challenges that we face if we look at the energy transition globally. I mean, we see countries like Germany, like the US, where we have a well-developed energy system, electricity system, and that with 100% coverage of the population, etc. And here we really see, you know, the need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So that means we need to build renewables, we need to deploy renewables, and we need to phase out fossil fuels. So essentially, yeah, growing one sector and phasing out another sector. In other countries, including China and India and a number of large emerging economies as well as developing countries, we see a situation where it's not just a matter of transitioning or transforming an existing energy sector, but it's the matter of also building out further the energy supply. So that means the challenge is a little bit different. It means that as we build out that energy supply to reach the entire population, to drive industrial developments, we should be doing this in a way that enables a progressive build out of clean energy rather than expanding fossil fuel energy supply, for example. And these are somewhat different challenges. And in practice, this has meant what we've actually seen in many countries like China, like India, is that we've actually seen an expansion of renewable energy, a very significant expansion in those leading countries. But alongside, we've also seen the expansion, nonetheless, of fossil fuel energy sources. And this, of course, contradicts the ultimate goal of decarbonizing the entire energy sector.
Rainer, in this article, we have selected specific countries for assessing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the global energy transition. And we use that term, right? A leader, or the other term, a laggard. So what makes a country a leader and what makes a country a laggard?
What we've actually done in the article is we've looked at this from a sectoral perspective, and we're only looking at energy supply here. And it's actually interesting to see how certain countries can be leaders in one sector, in one part of the energy transition, and not necessarily be a leader in another. So we've looked basically at renewables, coal energy, or coal-based electricity production, and then the fossil fuel sector, meaning oil and gas. And when we look at renewables, we see that the U.S., European Union, but also China and India are really important leaders in the deployment of renewable energy. When we look at the coal-based electricity generation, and as I mentioned before, India and China are actually also the main drivers today of the further expansion of coal-based electricity generation. So, while they are leaders in the field of renewables deployment, they are also simultaneously deploying very large amounts of coal-based electricity generation, which obviously is a huge challenge for the energy transition. And when we look at the oil and gas sector, fossil fuel dependent economies, we actually looked only at G20 countries to sort of limit the scope of the analysis. And there we took those countries that still have significant fossil fuel industries, that in this case includes also the US and Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and Latin America, but also, of course, Saudi Arabia and Russia. And there our question was really, to what extent is the COVID-19 crisis helping those countries diversify away from oil and gas as a sort of necessary pathway towards decarbonization in the long term. And so, yeah, we kind of contrasted that also to developments in countries that are basically fossil fuel importing countries, like, for instance, the EU and China.
Yes, and right at the beginning of 2020, we already had that big feud between Saudi Arabia and Russia involving oil and the prices of oil. So it's interesting to see how that escalated into the problems we had relating the oil and gas sector with the bigger COVID-19 scenario. When we go back to renewable energy, though, we see in the article that the shares of renewable power have increased in general, but investment in renewables has declined in 2020. So does this mean that there might be a trend in the making working against investment in renewables? How can we evaluate those numbers, and do we see a trend there?
I mean, there's definitely been a dip in investment in the energy sector in general, but that dip has been the least significant in the renewable energy space. So I think that in itself already sort of shows that most probably, if we look at the relative position of different parts of the energy sector, renewable energy is actually faring better than other parts. So that is actually a good sign, and I don't think that it signals a decline in general of investment, and this is sort of a reversal in a trend. But we do see differences between different countries, and in some countries, and especially in the leading countries, and we can talk about that a little bit more in more detail later, but we don't see necessarily that COVID is going to slow down or really hamper further deployment of renewable energy. But in some of those countries that were lagging behind already before COVID, the effects are potentially harmful, and there might actually be a significant delay in the further deployment of renewable energy as a result. So yeah, we can talk about that in more detail in a second.
Does that maybe mean that those projects in those developing countries were never very solid in the first place? Do you see it that way?
Well, I don't know. Like I said, I mean, there's just in general only a very small share of the deployment and the investment in renewable energy is actually happening in developing countries and emerging countries. Even if when we do look at that group of countries, we see even there, we see quite a concentration. If in Africa, we see major investments, relatively speaking, in South Africa and Morocco, but not so much in the rest of the continent, for example. And so COVID-19 for developing countries in general has had a major impact on the financing environment for renewable energy, because renewables are so capital intensive, so they rely on financing more so than traditional, conventional electricity production. This is obviously particularly harmful for renewable energy deployment in developing countries, and this is a result of the general economic fallout of COVID-19, impact on public finances in developing countries, without the ability to simply mobilize debt and sort of invest in the recovery the way we are seeing in the EU, in the US, where the ability is there to issue debt, while developing countries don't have that ability. Actually, the crisis is leading to constraints and sort of a narrowing margin to deploy public financing, and this public financing has to flow first and foremost into sort of social services, health, the health sector, and general economic stimulus. And there's just a reduced space then to go into these new sectors, which for many countries this is still very much a new sector. And finally, it's also hitting the utility sector in developing countries. Developing countries in many cases have people are struggling to pay their electricity bills. And as a result of the pandemic, there have been moves to forgive those debts, those consumer debts. But of course, this has an effect on utilities finances. And this, again, then has a knock-on effect on the ability to finance projects in the renewable energy sector. So I do think that maybe overall, there's going to be continued investment, and in the long term, this trend is not going to reverse, for sure not. But in the next few years, we really are going to see some delays, and we have already seen that. I mean, in Latin America, for instance, in 2020, there was not a single project awarded, renewable energy project awarded. Auctions have completely stopped. And of course, this means that this will have an effect also beyond 2020.
And that may also mean that the way towards energy transition will be less bold in a way. I think it was Indonesia that was mentioned in the article that decided to step back a little bit and start investing a little bit more in the transition to gas before making the full transition into actually green renewable energy production, right? So also those projects that were underway, maybe they will be a little bit scaled back in those countries that are
exactly. I mean, now you're picking up another issue, and that's the issue of fossil fuel dependent economies. And we've really seen that those economies that do still have a large stake in the fossil fuel sector, and this is across the board. This is not just a matter of developing or emerging countries. It's also in industrialized countries like the US and Canada. We do see that the government stimulus has also been oriented quite strongly towards the fossil fuel sector to save jobs, to save firms in that sector. And this obviously takes away the ability to invest in clean energy. Not as much in the case of the US, for instance, where there will still be the government will still have the ability to invest resources into the clean energy sector. But in coming back to the case of developing and emerging countries, this is obviously in a way a zero-sum game in a very constrained financing environment. And let's take the example of Mexico. Here also we've seen that there has been support to Pemex, to the main energy company in the country, in the fossil fuel sector, and this has come at the expense of renewable energy. Like I said, I mean, there haven't been any new projects. There's also been some policy measures taken that are not particularly favorable towards the renewable energy sector in Mexico. And this is a big challenge. And so sorry, coming back to Indonesia, obviously, and here we also see the exact same pattern. I mean, we see that there were some sort of tentative first steps towards introducing renewables more substantially in the electricity sector. And now as a result of the pandemic, there's been a sort of a retreat to the incumbent industry, because obviously Indonesia is one of the largest producers of coal resources in the world. A retreat to that sector, scaling back of plans to introduce renewables, and instead deploying stimulus to the mining sector, so also the coal mining sector. Yeah, and this simply sort of exacerbates lock-in effects that were already hampering the transition.
So these lock-in effects, they maybe have more to do with how the country has traditionally behaved when it comes to energy production, energy output, than necessarily to how developed or non-developed that country is. So you mentioned Canada and the United States, for example, and there were significant investments in fossil fuels during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that also has to do with how those countries were usually dependent on those types of production, I would assume, like Indonesia,
Yeah.
And Mexico, etc.
I think in the case of the US and Canada, we have to be a little bit more a little bit more specific in terms of what we're talking about, because they're very large countries, large economies, and I would say that the impact is more at the regional level. So if we take Canada, for example, in Canada, there was a very heavy response in favor of the fossil fuel sector in Alberta, in a very fossil fuel dependent province in Canada. Also, the national government provided stimulus to the fossil fuel sector in the form of funding to actually sort of reduce the carbon impact of the sector, but nonetheless, it was money flowing into the fossil fuel sector. But we cannot say, maybe it's not as generalized as in a country like Indonesia, where we really see the federal government or the national government being the main source of activity, and therefore we can take a more national perspective. Also in the US, I mean, of course, a state like California is one of the global leaders in clean energy, and the pandemic, or also in the wake of the pandemic, this will continue, and that this is continuing. But in other parts of the country, we see that there have been measures taken that will potentially exacerbate lock-in effects, such as lifting restrictions for investments in certain parts of the country, where there's drilling would be allowed now as a result of the lifting of these restrictions. We don't know for sure what effect this will actually have, because of course the Biden administration has come in, and now we're also seeing a reversal to a lot of these measures that were taking initially. So in the US, it's quite sort of early in a sense to really fully evaluate the impact of the pandemic on the clean energy transition.
And when one thinks about sustaining this deployment of renewable energy projects, the ones that were initiated before the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe some others, a few ones I would assume, that were initiated during the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's done. So in the article, we also touch upon the issue of countries that extend commissioning deadlines for ongoing projects, for example, that move forward with auctions that had specific deadlines to take place. I assume that's also some type of freedom those countries have that developing countries do not have. You just mentioned Latin America, for example, some auctions that were supposed to take place did not take place. So what was the space of maneuver that those more developed countries, when it comes to energy transition, had during the COVID-19 pandemic to play a little bit with deadlines, to extend commissioning deadlines, or move forward with auctions? How important were those in this very complicated times where you didn't have much room to actually play as usual?
Well, I think apart from the sort of constraints on finances, which I've already spoken about, which is obviously an issue, but there's also just the matter of kind of an existing ecosystem, right? So in a country like Germany, in many European countries, in the US, also in China, in India, there are existing renewable energy sectors that are well established from an industrial point of view, but also from a policy point of view. So there is a very well established way that renewables are promoted and deployed in those countries. And when the pandemic hit in some of these places, like India, for example, there were a lot of effects on construction in the case of India. Like, projects had significant challenges to face in terms of actually, continuing work on existing projects that were being built. But the government could very easily kind of take a decision to expand auctioning activity, to continue with those market support policies that are in place, that are well established. And now we can expect that in India, actually, we're going to have very substantial deployment of renewable energy in 2021, because auctioning has continued, has actually increased compared to 2019. In China, we saw a record year in terms of wind energy deployment already in 2020. In the US, we had an increase of renewable energy deployment compared to 2019. And in Europe, it's been more or less stable. Interesting part in Europe really is that Poland, which has been really a laggard in the context of the European Union, has decided to now place greater emphasis on the deployment of clean energy going forward. And this is partly, at least, related to, let's say, political window of opportunity that was there with the pandemic, to say, we will also reduce our support to the fossil fuel sector, to the coal-based sector, which is actually receives a lot of subsidies still from the government. So the pandemic giving an opportunity to say, well, in this difficult time, we cannot sustain these subsidies from the government to the extent that we have. Plus, there's a mechanism at the European level, the Just Transition mechanism, which provides an opportunity for Poland to receive European Union funding to actually invest in the transition. And it apparently has shown some effect, because there have been announcements, there have been policy measures taken by the government that show or seem to indicate that there has been this effect. But of course, we will have to see over time if this really then becomes more substantiated.
You just mentioned Poland, and Poland has historically been a strong producer of coal, and we still talk a lot about coal today. And that is one of the big problems when we talk about energy transition. So how do you phase out from coal, and why is it still so important to talk about that? Why is that not a problem that many countries still see as just necessary to overcome? So my first question here, so why is it still so important to talk about coal? And then how has the pandemic in general affected coal-based power generation?
Well, coal is the most CO2 intensive form of energy production, of electricity production. It's very substantial, its carbon footprint. So it's absolutely essential that coal-based electricity production is phased out if we want to reach climate mitigation targets. And why is it such a challenge? Well, I think this goes back to this point that I made about the regionalized nature of some of these things, especially in larger economies, where then in certain pockets, in certain regions, coal mining, for example, can be a very substantial source of income, of economic development for that region. And phasing out coal-based electricity production simply means that a lot of people in those regions, in a very localized, concentrated way, will lose their jobs and will be severely affected by this. So this makes it very challenging, especially in countries like Indonesia, like Poland, where there is still substantial coal mining also going on. But we do also see that with the overall trends towards decarbonization, towards carbon pricing, towards a climate policy, and with a very rapidly decreasing cost for renewable energy, that coal-based electricity production is not really profitable going forward, and in many cases is already no longer profitable. And this means that we're seeing, especially in the US and Europe, a sort of market-driven phase out also of coal-based electricity production. Old power plants are being shut down because they are no longer profitable in the existing policy and market environment. Nonetheless, it is a challenge for governments to deal with this, deal with local populations, to overcome these lock-in effects at the local, at the regional level. And we also see this in China. I mean, in China, we do see indications. We've seen that China has announced a climate neutrality target in 2060 now during the pandemic. So moves towards, more ambitious climate policy on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that at the provincial level, there's been a record permitting or sort of issuing of permits for coal-based power plants. So, sort of signaling that we're going to see a boom in an investment in coal-based electricity production in China. This is a complete contradiction. But of course, it also shows us again that, these large countries, in particular, they're not monolithic. And we do see also struggles going on, in this case, between the central government on the one hand and provincial governments that still have important stakes in coal-based electricity production, where this is a significant economic sector that creates jobs and is also exposed to lots of influence from large firms, state-owned enterprises, that have an important influence also on government decision-making. So we see these struggles going on globally, but also at the national level in many cases.
Still on the economic importance of coal, we can try and talk a little bit about oil and gas, because the COVID-19's impact on oil and gas industries has also been significant. So prices in 2020, they were well below 2019 levels. Should we expect such trends to go on? Because you were mentioning the lock-in effects for specific countries or for the maybe oil market in general. So couldn't oil and gas make a recovery, especially because of those lock-ins in specific countries? How do you see that happening in 2021?
I mean, the first thing that we've seen now is that the oil price has actually recovered, right? We have almost the same oil price today that we had a year ago, more or less, when the pandemic started. But of course, this is not a result of a rebound in demand. We don't have the same levels of demand. There has been an effective intervention in the market by oil-producing countries who have actually cut the levels of output. So as a result, supply and demand have sort of aligned at a similar point that they had a year ago at a much higher level of demand. Now, the big question, I think, here is, will demand rebound? Essentially, this is the big question. I mean, there are some signs, I think, that this is likely to happen. Of course, now we still have sort of a reduced demand in the aviation sector. There's much less air travel going on. That is reduced demand in the oil sector. I'm not so sure about the data here, but probably there's also reduced road transport. But I mean, most analysts, I think, expect after a certain transition period, probably in 2021, this demand to rebound, to come back. Now, as we said in the article, again, in this period, of course, there's been a financial impact on oil producing companies, firms that are invested in the oil and gas sector. And the big question is also, how are they responding? How are they responding to this? And it looks like, again, this is sort of an uneven picture. So actually, we've seen that in the European oil majors, according to reports in the media, have actually scaled back investment overall, but they have not scaled back investment in clean energy. In the US, there's a different picture. I mean, we see that there was not a significant sort of diversification movement among those companies before the pandemic, and we also don't see that now in the wake of the pandemic, and most likely there will be a rebound in investment. Of course, that said, of course, with the election of Joe Biden as president in the US, we also have a very different sort of policy environment that the sector is facing. Biden has been pretty outspoken about his desire to curtail further investments in oil and gas exploration, extraction in the US. He canceled or reversed the decision that Trump made, for instance, to build the Keystone Pipeline. It's also implications for Canada. And we spoke about Alberta earlier. Actually, one of the measures that the government had taken is to heavily subsidize the construction of this pipeline, which now, due to decisions in the US, will probably not take place. So yeah, I think that deployed some of the stimulus spending on exploration in the Arctic. Exploring that oil, scholars who have researched this say, is completely inconsistent with reaching climate targets, international climate targets. So there seems to be, a negative impact here from the pandemic as a result of the government's actions in this particular case. But so yeah, it's an uneven picture. And I think that's really one of the key messages of this article, is that, the pandemic is having impacts that are playing out very differently across different jurisdictions. And yes, I agree to the point you made earlier that this is very much related to the stance of the government ultimately, and the lock-in effects locally or nationally. This goes back to the point, the increasing role of the government. We see an increasing role of the government, but so it becomes very crucial, also what the government then ends up doing.
True, Reiner. And just to close, what do you think we should pay attention to now that we have all this data that not only the article provides, but what you also brought to the interview, to have a closer view on this developments when it comes to renewable energy in 2021 and a just energy transition? What signs, what factors should we pay attention to if we want to see how this will all play out?
Well, I mean, I would like to close by saying that I think that what we really see, especially also this point on the very constrained ability of governments in many developing and emerging countries, but also the lock-in effects affecting government responses in many fossil fuel producing countries. This really speaks to the need to really step up international efforts in two ways, in two sort of general senses. And one is to really find ways to channel financing into these economies, and channel this financing in a way that it's going to stimulate climate-friendly investment. I think that we really need to rethink, the environment in that sense. I mean, we cannot go on just sort of hoping for the best in these countries. There needs to be an active there need to be active measures to create financing vehicles, to create an environment that allows deployment of green stimulus spending in developing and emerging countries. There's been talks about the IMF taking a more proactive stance also in enabling these kinds of the provision of financing also beyond the sort of just kind of stabilization of financial markets, the balance of payments of countries, but actually taking a more active role and also directing financing to these countries in a way that is in line with international climate targets. There needs to be a provision of large-scale resources, really, by those countries that have the ability to do so, that have the fiscal space to do so, to allow developing countries to invest in these new sectors. And the second point is that we also need to very actively, I think, start addressing at the international level the question of phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, again, we see that the pandemic has created some quite negative dynamics in countries that are, in a way, locked in to these fossil fuel economies, and we cannot simply ignore that. I mean, we need to start entering more actively in a dialogue with these countries, define strategies, develop strategies, and also, provide incentives to do so. I mean, the emerging discourse on hydrogen as one area that could provide, economic incentives for investment, also in some of these fossil fuel producing countries, is one step in the right direction, possibly. Russia is a candidate here, but also some countries in the Middle East. But the point here, I think, is that we need a just transition discussion, not just in kind of Western regions where we're phasing out, for example, coal mining in places like the US or Europe. We've seen some sort of more substantial debate on this. We have not really seen very much more substantiated, sort of in-depth thinking and discussions about what does this just transition mean for entire countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and what can we offer these countries in going forward as an incentive to really become part of this transition and devise strategies for them to profit from the transition. Because I think what's not going to work is to simply move forward in certain parts of the world and kind of watch other countries lag behind, become further increase potentially even their lock-ins in the old fossil-based economic development paradigm. Because then we run into a situation where we really have potential in destabilizing effects from the energy transition on these regions, which in the first place maybe weren't the most stable socio-politically, and this could become a real liability, I think, for the energy transition. And so it's something that we really need to spend more time discussing, debating, and also devising very concrete measures to deal with.
The COVID-19 crisis deepens the gulf between leaders and laggards in the global energy transition. This is an article published by Rainer Quitzel, Herman Versali, Laima Eike, Joschka Jan, Johan Niljenstam, Flavio Lira, Adela Marian, Diana Zusse, Sapan Tapar, Sylvia Wecko, Stefan Williams, and Bing Shui. You can find it on the April edition of Energy Research and Social Science. You can just follow the link that we have here below the video. Rainer, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Flavio.